is retroactive legislation for stuff already happening. Is that the space we are now in as a tactic, allowing the worst case scenario and then fighting the legislation when they try and impose that once the activities are already in place? And Tangerine.
Yeah, so to Matt's question, I think, I don't think we want to approach this as if we take away one unconstitutional they're losing, will it make another one worse? I think we need to do everything we can to take away just one unconstitutional law that they're using or tool that they're using, and then go after the next one and the next one and the next one. We need a win. The people need a win, and they need a significant one, and we can start here.
And then to the question of, are we in a place now that every battle is a retroactive one?
If it is, then we might as well give up. If it's just retroactive, why bother? You have to be proactive. I mean, the issues here are fundamental to who we are as human beings. We're in this together. This is not just one person. Many people have taken individual stands, but they couldn't have done that without others supporting them. I'm a prime case in point.
I think we're proactive.
Sure, but
yeah,
retroactively.
Right, but what we're seeing is essentially a reconfiguration of the legal system to justify murder, torture, the stripping of due process, things that empire has already, empire is a disease, and things that empire has already begun to do. And we can't roll over, so that when they create the FISA Amendment Act, or when they pass the NDAA, then we have to rise up and stop it, because it is attempting to give them legal cover. And I think it was somebody on the panel last time said quite correctly, maybe it was Carl, but there's a kind of expansion of this, both in terms of the spreading of wars across the Middle East, into Yemen, Somalia, of course Pakistan, and it's all interconnected with a kind of legal justification for more and more egregious assaults, not only in terms of the mechanisms of empire, but in terms of our own civil liberties.
Look, our system of justice, that's supposed to be used to pass Enabling Act legislation. It becomes by default ex post facto legal. I mean, that is not our system of justice. What you're seeing since 9/11 is the executive branch is subverting the Constitution. They want to take the power under themselves. They're betting, they have to, betting on a compliant Congress, a complicit Congress, and a judiciary that's not going to stand up to them. So what they end up doing is they will force certain kinds of Enabling Act legislation to Congress to make legal. That's the ex post facto side that was once illegal. The FISA Amendments Act is certainly a case in point. The other thing to do is they will do signing statements, or they will secretly interpret the existing legislation that doesn't suit their needs in terms of the national security state. That's precisely what was done with the Patriot Act. Section 215, the secret interpretation, which many of the senators who are on the SISI know what that secret interpretation is as well. It's pretty darn clear what it is. If you're a subscriber, you have information of the business, it's not yours, you don't own it. The corporation owns it. Because the corporation owns it, guess what? They can provide it to the government for national security purposes, or the government has direct access to it. That's just one example. And the Patriot Act was passed in the fall of 2001. These are all Enabling Act legislation. They're designed to ensure the increasing reality of an imperial presidency. That's what it is. And yet, at the same time, the emperor of that imperial presidency has no clothes. So what you're seeing under the NDAA is, what do you wrap yourself in? The gossamer thread of military force? The last thing you can compensate for as the President of the United States is to go to that commander-in-chief. I have the power, I have the authority. Who's going to stop him? Anybody's read Catch-22, the Joseph Heller novel, that's precisely, for all of the sarcasm, and for all the parody in that book, in the end, it's quite frightening. Who's going to stop us? We have the power.
Now that we've drifted over to our whistleblowers, it was, we brought this up a little bit earlier in the panel. What, if anything, does this law have to do with WikiLeaks or with Bradley Manning?
Well, it has a lot to do with whistleblowers. You think about Dan Ellsberg, the most dangerous man in America. And then, in my case, I blew the whistle on torture in the case of the American Taliban, John Walker Lind. And I was branded a traitor, a turncoat, and a terrorist sympathizer. 10 years later, I'm defending people like Tom Drake and John Kiriakou, who are being prosecuted under the Espionage Act. They're being labeled enemies of the state, one of the most serious charges that can be leveled against an American. And this kind of language falls within the ambit of the very vague and ambiguous NDAA supporting terrorism. You can easily see how that connection can be made. And I thought it was bad enough when whistleblowers were being fired and blacklisted and smeared and bankrupted, and then it escalates to the government trying to put them in jail. But what's even worse is a prospect that they could be disappeared completely and detained indefinitely without charge, counsel, or judicial review.
But it's still prospect, right? You know, why do you see that next step happening?
I see that next step happening because Obama has escalated, he's created a war on whistleblowers that he's escalated by an order of magnitude between Dan Ellsberg being the first person charged under the Espionage Act for allegedly mishandling classified information. There were a couple of others, and Tom became the fourth person in history, and now there are 7 people, 6 of whom at least are whistleblowers, who've been charged with espionage for allegedly mishandling allegedly classified information that, for example, in Tom Drake's case, turned out to be completely unclassified. So I see this as another tool in the arsenal that they will not hesitate to use against whistleblowers, because what this is about shutting down information and chilling speech.
Mr. Drake, just for perhaps the audience members that aren't aware, would you be able to swiftly run through your ordeal?
I was a senior executive of the National Security Agency, and to my utter horror, I discovered within weeks of 9/11 that the National Security Agency, headed up at the time by Lieutenant General Michael V. Hayden, had entered into a secret agreement with the White House, in which the White House had made NSA the executive agent for the tippy-top surveillance program, the so-called warrantless wiretapping program, the Stellar Wind program. I found that out, and I raised my concerns, alarms, within NSA. First week in October 2001, I had the most chilling of conversations with the senior attorney at NSA, who made it unmistakably clear that NSA had become the executive agent for the White House. It was all legal. The White House had approved it, and you do not want to ask any more questions, Mr. Drake. Don't go there. I knew in that moment, that was my moment of truth, I knew in that moment that what I was an eyewitness to was a very subversion of our own Constitution. And I knew in that moment, in that very moment, that not only had the wheels come off a 23-year legal regime, and the wheels had come off the Fourth Amendment in secret, that we were in an entirely new vehicle. This was not a constitutional form of government. This was an alien form of government. It was a secret government being run by executive rule. And everything that has happened since 9/11 has simply increased the power of that secret government. The Constitution for them is just a piece of paper. It's an inconvenient truth. It's not a grand experiment. We don't really have constitutional governments anymore. It is a figment of our imagination. It is hollowed out Constitution. So the NDAA takes it to the next level. Not only was I prosecuted and indicted, and at one point facing, as the original prosecutor said quite clearly during an interrogation session at a secret FBI facility in the greater DC area, how would you like to spend the rest of your life in prison, Mr. Drake, unless you start cooperating with us, we might let you off for 15 or 20 years, maybe. That's what's facing this country. I was charged on the Espionage Act. That's the most egregious thing you can charge an American with. I was behind several 8 balls when they indicted me, 5 counts on the Espionage Act. But this takes it to the next level. At least I had access and recourse to the judicial system, and in fact, a third branch of government stood up to the government during my sentencing hearing on July 15, 2011. What we're seeing with the NDAA is something that's even more sinister.
Picking up on what Tom said, the problem with the NDAA is it would not give people like Tom access to the civilian court system and innocent until proven guilty and guilt having to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. It would move you into this netherland of indefinite preventive detention, and if you got some kind of hearing at all, it would be under a much lower standard of preponderance of the evidence. So, like numerous other extrajudicial, extra-legal structures that have been created in the wake of 9/11, this is yet another black hole that we are creating that can be put up there with Guantanamo Bay and a whole bunch of other.
I lived in Latin America for 6 years, and the same phenomena happened there under Pinochet and the dirty war in Argentina. What we're talking about is the capacity of the U.S. government to make you disappear.
They've already been doing this since 2001, including in this country. They just want to codify it. And so they decided, instead of using the normal legislative process in terms of the civilian law, the civilian judicial system, we're going to do this through the military side.
Can I ask a question? I'm curious what you think what we should do to rally our fellow citizens about this, because this is really, I think most people aren't that aware of it. If they are, they're not that frightened of it. And yet, as you said in the first panel, Chris, they try this stuff out overseas, and then if it works there, they do it here. And we have to understand that this is just if you put just a small pinprick in your roof, that's not going to make your roof fall down. But eventually, over time, enough water will wear away. That tiny pinhole becomes a larger hole, and that becomes something that comes through into your home. And I think that's what's going on here. And so I think I'm just curious what you think. What do we need? What's going to be the tipping point to get our fellow Americans to do something in the way that? And this is probably a horrible example, but because I'd hate for our civil liberties to have to reach the horrific in what happened in Newtown. But what happened in Newtown is the tipping point. The NRA is done. Their influence, they are done. The American public, just everyday Americans, when people had to go back the first week of January and drop their kids off at school in the morning on January 3rd, whatever it was, and every morning since then, everybody who's got kids has been wondering if they're going to see their kids at the end of the day. And they are fucked from that moment on, and something's going to happen. It won't be what we all hope will happen, but something's going to happen. What do we need to do to not wait for the Newtown of this, but to rally people so that this isn't a panel here in New York where we're talking about this, or a lawsuit in federal court, but we actually, because I think if the American people really understood this, I do believe they would be very, very concerned about it.
The problem is that the corporate coup has seized our systems of information. So, especially if you have a half dozen corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Disney, Clear Channel, that control what most Americans listen to and watch. And it's either celebrity entertainment for trivia, or on the quote-unquote news channels like Fox or MSNBC, they're propaganda outlets for systems of power. The NDAA case was never mentioned on MSNBC because it made Obama look bad. Never. It wasn't mentioned on Fox because it has bipartisan support. Ironically, the one established journalistic institution that covered the NDAA trial and case responsibly was my old employer, the New York Times. for whatever their elitism, and it's there, they still understood that this was significant, that this was journalism. And that was a very chilling, frightening moment for me, because it was a window into the degradation of systems of information, in essence entertainment, that passed themselves off as journalism. I think you're right. And I think what struck fear in the heart of the power elite was the Occupy movement, not because it was a radical movement, although they like to think of themselves as radicals, but because it was a mainstream movement. It actually articulated the concerns, the grievances of the mainstream. And you could see it every weekend in Zuccotti Park with mothers and fathers from New Jersey, and I'm from New Jersey, pushing their strollers up and down. I brought my own kids in. And that struck terror in the heart of the corporate state. Suddenly, the dialogue was about what was real. The issues were real, which is why they shut down the encampments. Now, if you read Paul Krugman, there are constant appeals to respond rationally to the economic crisis. A jobs program, forgiveness of student debt, that's not Paul, that's me, but a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, a sane healthcare system, that would be rational. But what we have is a species of political paralysis. Because of corporate forces are so powerful, they can't respond. The mechanisms of power can't respond. And the only response of the state was violent, to physically try and erase the encampments. Now, I've covered disintegrating societies all around the world. I've covered popular movements, the street demonstrations that brought down Milosevic. I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. I was in Prague. I was in East Germany, Palestinian uprisings. And it's always the ruling elite that determines the configuration of rebellion. And because the ruling elite has not responded rationally to what's happened, in fact, of course, things are getting worse through the fiscal cliff, the refusal to restore unemployment benefits, the utterly mendacious figures on unemployment, just lying through their teeth, erasing people from the rolls, or people who work 28 hours a week at Walmart or below the poverty line or employed, et cetera, something's going to happen. I've been in those situations where you feel it, you know it's coming. You never know what triggers it. You never know what that tipping point is. It's usually something utterly benign.